In the span of just a few months, between 2025 and 2026, something quietly historic happened. The leaders of France, Britain, Russia, and the United States, 4 of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, all traveled to the same country, China. That is not a coincidence. That is diplomacy. There are moments in history when the fate of millions doesn't depend on the size of an army, the range of a missile, or the outcome of a battle. It depends on a decision made behind a closed door, a single sentence spoken at the right moment, a handshake between 2 men who spent decades calling each other enemies. Those moments rarely make dramatic headlines at the time, yet they quietly reshape the world for generations. History is often taught as a timeline of wars, revolutions, and elections. We memorize dates, names, and treaties as if history were simply a collection of events. But history is something far more human. It is a story of leaders facing impossible choices, trying to solve problems where every option carries enormous risk. One mistake can start a war. One successful negotiation can prevent one. The greatest victories in geopolitics are often invisible because they happen before a single shot is fired. If you want to understand why the United States and China are strategic rivals today, why Taiwan remains one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints, why alliances in Asia continue to expand, and why global politics still revolves around the Pacific, you have to begin with one extraordinary secret mission in the summer of 1971. It began with a lie. In July of that year, Henry Kissinger, the national security advisor to President Richard Nixon, arrived in Pakistan as part of what appeared to be a routine diplomatic visit. Journalists followed every step, cameras captured every handshake, and nothing seemed unusual. Then suddenly, the White House announced that Kissinger had become ill. He was reportedly suffering from stomach problems and needed several days of rest in the cool hills outside Islamabad. The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. The reporters packed up their equipment, accepted the official story, and moved on. Except it wasn't true. Henry Kissinger wasn't resting in the mountains. While the world's attention drifted elsewhere, he quietly slipped away from public view, climbed aboard an unmarked Pakistani aircraft, and disappeared into the sky. His destination was one of the most isolated countries on Earth, Communist China. The flight itself lasted only a few hours. Its consequences would last for generations. At that moment, the United States and the People's Republic of China had not spoken directly for more than 20 years. They had fought against each other during the Korean War. American politicians routinely described Communist China as a dangerous enemy. Chinese propaganda portrayed the United States as the leader of imperialism. There were no embassies, no direct phone lines, no diplomatic relations. To most people, the idea that America's top diplomat would secretly fly to Beijing was almost unimaginable. So why would the Nixon administration take such an extraordinary risk? Because great diplomacy begins with seeing the world as it truly is, not as you wish it to be. Most people think the Cold War was a simple contest between 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. That picture is incomplete. By the late 1960s, another struggle had emerged inside the communist world itself. China and the Soviet Union, once revolutionary partners, had become bitter rivals. Their ideological disagreements had evolved into military confrontation. In 1969, soldiers from both countries exchanged gunfire along their shared border. Intelligence reports suggested that Moscow was even considering military action against China's nuclear facilities. To the average observer, this looked like chaos. To Nixon and Kissinger, it looked like opportunity. Here lies one of the most important principles of diplomacy, one that every diplomat, negotiator, and leader should remember. The strongest position does not always belong to the strongest country. It belongs to the country that best understands the relationships between everyone else. This idea is known as the balance of power. Imagine 3 competitors standing in a room. If 2 of them unite against the third becomes vulnerable. But if one competitor can persuade one rival to change sides, the entire balance shifts without anyone becoming stronger. Nothing about military strength has changed. Only the relationships have changed. That is exactly what Nixon wanted. America could not defeat both the Soviet Union and China simultaneously, but perhaps it didn't have to. If Washington could improve relations with Beijing, the Soviet Union would suddenly face pressure from both East and West. Moscow would no longer confront one opponent. It would confront 2. This was not friendship. It was strategy. One of the hardest lessons for ordinary people to accept is that countries do not behave like individuals. Friends forgive each other. Families remain loyal through difficult times. Nations rarely think that way. Nations pursue interests. Today's enemy can become tomorrow's partner if circumstances change. Today's ally can become tomorrow's competitor if interests begin to diverge. Many people criticize diplomacy because they expect morality alone to guide international politics. But diplomats live in a different reality. Their first responsibility is not to create perfect friendships. It is to protect their country's long-term security. That is why great diplomacy often feels uncomfortable. It forces leaders to speak with people they deeply distrust. Kissinger understood this better than most. The secret journey to Beijing was not built in a single afternoon. It required months of careful planning through Pakistan, one of the few countries maintaining good relations with both governments. Messages passed quietly through trusted intermediaries. Every detail mattered. Every conversation was carefully protected. If news of the mission reached Moscow before the negotiations began, the Soviet Union could react aggressively. If domestic opponents in Washington discovered the plan too early, political backlash might destroy the entire effort. Sometimes leadership is not about making popular decisions. Sometimes it is about making necessary decisions before anyone else understands why they are necessary. When Kissinger finally arrived in Beijing, he was greeted by Premier Zhou Enlai, one of the 20th century's greatest diplomats. Zhou possessed something that every successful negotiator needs but few truly master. He listened before he spoke. He understood that diplomacy is not a competition to prove who is right. It is an exercise in discovering where interests overlap. The meetings between Kissinger and Zhou were not emotional reunions between former enemies. They were careful discussions between two experienced strategists who understood that history had created a rare opportunity. America wanted to reshape the global balance against the Soviet Union. China wanted protection against a growing Soviet military threat. Different motivations. One shared interest. This is another lesson history quietly teaches. Successful diplomacy does not require identical goals. It requires compatible interests. That difference explains countless events in both history and today's headlines. When people ask why countries cooperate despite having different political systems, different cultures, or even different values, the answer is often surprisingly simple. Shared interests outweigh shared ideology. That realization changed the 20th century, and it continues to shape the 21st. Every time you hear about tensions in the Taiwan Strait, trade wars between Washington and Beijing, sanctions, military alliances, or competition over artificial intelligence and semiconductors, remember this. These headlines didn't appear overnight. They are the latest chapter in a story that began decades ago, when a handful of leaders chose diplomacy over confrontation and strategy over emotion. History isn't just a collection of dates buried in old textbooks. It's a record of real people making impossible decisions under extraordinary pressure. Every alliance, every treaty, every secret negotiation leaves fingerprints on the world we inherit. The leaders who understand this don't simply react to history. They shape it. For diplomats, this story is a lesson in leadership, patience, and strategic thinking. For students of international relations, it is a reminder that power is measured not only by armies and economies, but by the ability to understand interests, build relationships, and change the calculations of rivals. And for all of us, it reveals an eye-opening truth. The world is often transformed not by the battles everyone remembers, but by the conversations almost no one knew were taking place. The most powerful weapon in geopolitics is not always a missile or an aircraft carrier. Sometimes it's a well-timed conversation. Sometimes it's the courage to negotiate with an enemy. And sometimes it's the wisdom to recognize that changing one relationship can change the course of history. If you enjoy exploring the hidden stories behind world politics, diplomacy, and the decisions that continue to shape our future, subscribe to Decoded Geopoly. Because history isn't just about the past, it's the key to understanding the world we live in today.